At current, the South African Parliament, through the Portfolio Committee of Labour, is discussing 3 bills which are related to some of the most prolific labour law amendments that the country has seen in over 20 years. And that is specifically the national minimum wage that was supposed to be implemented on the 1st of May, but of course, because of the workload that is involved in the creation of such legislation, they've had to push that date back. What the national minimum wage will do is set a floor base of 20 Rand per hour that will have to be paid to workers who are currently earning less than 20 Rand an hour, and that is calculated to be close to 3,500 Rand a month. Now, currently, we have over 50% of the South African labour market that earns anything between 13 Rand per hour and 15 Rand. So this 20 Rand will lift those workers onto some form of an increased wage, but it does not necessarily equal a living wage, which is what labour unions have been pushing for decades, pushing for some sort of a wage that will lift what we call the working poor in South Africa out of poverty to ensure that they're able to lead respectable and dignified lives. Now, the other bill that is before Parliament is amendments to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act that deals specifically with the kind of fallbacks or the kind of loopholes that will be left by the implementation of the national minimum wage. For example, it encompasses the determination or the protection of sexual determinations, which are currently being used to determine the wages of some of the most vulnerable employees in the South African labour market, and those are domestic workers, security workers, as well as farm workers. And those minimum wages have been determined using sectoral determinations for years, but with the advent of the national minimum wage, that function would have gone away had it not been for the amendments that are currently being included in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. And just this week, the Labour Portfolio Committee approved that it should be retained. Now, this brings us to the 3rd bill that is before Parliament, and that is the amendments to the Labour Relations Act. Of course, that act is the cornerstone of all policy in the country's labour market and has ensured that some of the most progressive systems in the labour market are introduced. What it does is introduce a clause or a provision that will see organised labour in the form of unions having to ballot their members before strikes are convened. Sort of the strike that we are seeing today would have had to undergo a process where workers would have to literally vote through a ballot to show their support for such an industrial action. And this is to mitigate against long strikes. This is to mitigate against strikes that turn violent. And that is a regulation of that particular space in the labour market. And if we are to compare these changes that were just mentioned with the current strike that is ongoing in the country, being of course staged by the South African Federation of Trade Unions, which is a year old, this is in opposition to those amendments. But of course, most of their issues, or one of the most strongest opposition they have, is against the 20 Rand per hour rate that has been set for the national minimum wage. They feel that workers deserve more. They're in fact demanding a 12,500 Rand monthly rate for workers across the country as a minimum wage. And what economists and experts found, even recommendations from the International Labour Organization, was that a 12,500 Rand minimum wage would absolutely kill jobs, because if it's set too high, it's just as problematic as it were to be set too low. Now, the other opposition, of course, that SAFTU has raised is that they want the scrapping of all those amendments that are currently before Parliament, and they are basically arguing that they are the most regressive and exploitative since the end of apartheid. And this, of course, juxtaposes them politically as well at the opposite end of other labour formations in the country that have supported these changes and have said that will bring about labour stability where there has been unrest. For example, the prevalence of long strikes that harm the economy.